I never thought I would seriously ask myself this question, but one night it finally settled in my mind quietly and without drama. What if my husband wasn't just lying about me? What if he was preparing people for my death? At first, the thought sounded ridiculous, almost insulting to my own intelligence. I told myself it was dramatic, paranoid, something only someone unstable would think. But once the idea appeared, it refused to leave. It sat in the back of my mind, replaying every strange interaction, every uncomfortable moment I had brushed off before. I am 26 years old, and I have been married to my husband for a little over 2 years. From the outside, our life looks ordinary. No wealth, no chaos, no visible danger. Just a young couple trying to get by. That's what I believed, at least. Looking back now, I realize how carefully that illusion was maintained. The truth was quieter, slower, and far more disturbing. It started with something small. One evening, my husband told me not to go into the local shop where he works. It's the only grocery store in our area, and we shop there regularly, so I asked why. He said he had left work early and had used me as an excuse. That didn't seem strange at first, until he added that it would be awkward if I showed up. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten, but I ignored the feeling and told myself I was overthinking. A few days later, he left his phone unlocked on the table. I wasn't suspicious. I wasn't looking for anything. But the screen lit up with a message preview that mentioned my name, and curiosity got the better of me. What I found made my blood run cold. He had told a coworker that I had gone missing. Not figuratively. Literally missing. He said he had to leave work early to look for me. He added that I was on suicide watch and that he had already called the police. None of that was true. I had never gone missing. I had never been on suicide watch. The police had never been called. I remember staring at the screen, rereading the messages over and over, trying to find a reasonable explanation that would make it make sense. There wasn't one. Not long after that, he told me we couldn't go to shop on Thursdays anymore. He explained it casually, like it was a minor inconvenience. When I asked why, he said he had told his coworkers that Thursdays were my therapy days and that he needed time off to take me to appointments. Again, none of it was true. I have no history of mental illness. I have never been to therapy. Yet, to the people in his life, I was slowly becoming someone unstable, someone who couldn't be left alone. The lies didn't stop there. Another time, he told his coworkers he had to stay home because my mental health was declining. When he finally returned to work, he explained that my brother was now staying with me, so it was safe for him to leave. I haven't spoken to my brother in months. By that point, it felt like I was living 2 separate lives. There was the version of me I knew, functional and aware, and then there was the version of me my husband was presenting to the world, fragile and dangerous to herself. I tried to rationalize it. My husband has always been a compulsive liar. I knew that before we got married. He is diagnosed with autism, ADHD, and narcissistic personality disorder. He struggles with anger and control, and I had already endured years of emotional abuse. He put me down privately and sometimes in front of others. He controlled where I went, who I talked to, and how I spent my time. He never hit me, but he had threatened violence before, usually disguised as jokes. I told myself these lies were just another example of him exaggerating to get out of work. Then I remembered something he had said months earlier. We were sitting on the couch, watching television, when he started talking about how isolated my life was. He laughed as he pointed out that I didn't talk to my friends often and that I didn't see my family regularly. Then he calmly explained how someone could kill me and get away with it. He said no one would notice if I disappeared, that he could call my workplace and tell them I quit, that my absence wouldn't raise any alarms. I forced a laugh at the time and told myself it was just a dark joke. But jokes don't rehearse logistics. When I connected that comment with the lies he had been telling about my mental health, something inside me shifted. If I died suddenly, everyone would already believe I was unstable. I started questioning myself constantly. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe this was anxiety. Maybe I was becoming exactly what he described me as. That doubt was the most dangerous part. Because if I did nothing, if I ignored it, and something happened to me, his version of me would be the only one anyone ever knew. I kept asking myself the same question. Was I seeing a pattern, or was I losing my grip on reality? The answer scared me, because the more I paid attention, the clearer it became. This wasn't chaos. It was preparation. And once I understood that, I knew I couldn't afford to ignore it anymore. Once the idea settled in my mind, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction, every conversation, every casual comment suddenly carried a second meaning. I started replaying moments from our relationship that I had dismissed before, moments that felt insignificant at the time, but now lined up with unsettling clarity. He had always liked to control the narrative. Not just arguments, but reality itself. If we disagreed about something that had happened, he would insist my memory was wrong. If I reacted emotionally, he would smirk and tell me I was being dramatic. If I stood my ground, he would accuse me of being unstable. I had learned, slowly and painfully, that the easiest way to survive was to doubt myself before doubting him. What frightened me most wasn't the lies themselves. It was how consistent they were. He didn't tell one person I was struggling. He told multiple people the same story, with the same details. Therapy days, police involvement, suicide watch. He was building a version of me that existed independently of my consent. A version that could easily explain my absence if I ever stopped answering messages, stopped showing up to work, stopped existing. I realized then that this wasn't random lying. It was rehearsal. I began paying attention to how often he emphasized my fragility in conversation. He would sigh loudly if I seemed tired and ask if I was okay mentally. He would tell people right in front of me that I needed extra support. If I objected, he'd laugh it off and say he was just worried about me. Concern became his favorite weapon. Anyone who questioned him would immediately sound cruel. Who criticizes a man for caring about his wife? At night, lying beside him, I stopped sleeping deeply. I listened to his breathing, to the way he shifted in bed. I watched for patterns in his routines. I noticed how carefully he managed his image, how charming he could be when others were around, how cold he became the moment we were alone. I started documenting things privately. Dates, times, statements. I didn't know what I was preparing for, only that something inside me was screaming not to ignore this anymore. I also noticed how isolated I had become without realizing it. He had never explicitly told me I couldn't see friends or family. He didn't need to. He made it inconvenient. He discouraged visits. He criticized the people I loved until spending time with them felt exhausting. Over time, my world shrank to the size of our home and his approval. When he joked that no one would notice me missing, it wasn't just a threat. It was an observation he had engineered. Still, doubt clung to me. I asked myself if I was catastrophizing, if I was projecting fear onto behavior that could be explained by his diagnoses, his immaturity, his tendency to lie. I wondered if leaving would make me the villain, if people would believe him when he said I was unstable. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very story he was spreading was the one trapping me. The breaking point came quietly, not with a threat or a fight or a dramatic moment. It came when I imagined something happening to me accidentally. A sudden illness, a fall, anything. And I realized how easily it would be reframed. How quickly his version would replace mine. I understood then that even if he never intended to hurt me physically, he had already created a situation where my voice didn't matter, where my reality could be overwritten. That was when fear turned into resolve. I stopped asking whether I was paranoid. I started asking what I needed to survive. I knew I couldn't confront him. Confrontation would only teach him what I knew. I knew I couldn't warn people openly without evidence. It would reinforce the narrative he had already planted. I had to move quietly, carefully. I reached out to organizations anonymously. I asked questions without naming names. I learned what resources existed if I needed to leave quickly. I memorized phone numbers. I hid essentials. I waited. Every day felt like walking on thin ice. I smiled when he smiled. I nodded when he spoke. I let him believe I was exactly who he thought I was. Inside, I was preparing to disappear on my own terms. Not as a tragedy, not as a cautionary tale, but as someone who chose herself. Eventually, I made contact with the council. I explained enough to be taken seriously without giving him any warning. They listened. They didn't question my sanity. They didn't dismiss my fear. They told me emergency accommodation was available, that I wouldn't be trapped if I chose to leave. For the first time in months, I felt something loosen in my chest. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. And I wasn't powerless. I was just someone who had been surviving a situation designed to make me doubt my right to exist independently. And I was done playing that role. Leaving didn't happen the way movies portray it. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument, no slammed doors. It happened quietly, on an ordinary day, while he was at work telling people I couldn't be left alone. I packed only what I could carry without raising suspicion. Documents, clothes, a phone charger, the things that make it possible to exist independently. My hands shook the entire time, not because I doubted my decision, but because I knew how dangerous it would be if he sensed even a hint of change. I walked out of the house like I was running an errand. I didn't look back. I didn't leave a note. I didn't give him the opportunity to rewrite the moment. I went straight to the emergency accommodation arranged for me. When the door closed behind me and locked from the inside, something inside my body finally collapsed. Not in fear, but in exhaustion. I realized I had been holding myself together by force of will for far too long. The days that followed were surreal. Without him there to correct my thoughts, to reinterpret my memories, to quietly undermine my confidence, my mind began to clear. I replayed conversations with new clarity. I saw patterns I couldn't see before. The lies were no longer confusing. They were obvious, methodical, intentional. The version of me he had been creating for others was never meant to help me. It was meant to replace me. I informed the necessary people carefully and selectively. My workplace. A trusted family member. I didn't overshare. I didn't dramatize. I stated facts. I explained why I was leaving and why contact through him was unsafe. The responses I received were not disbelief or judgment. They were concern, support, relief that I had spoken up. That reaction alone told me everything I needed to know about how distorted my reality had become while living with him. When he realized I was gone, his reaction followed the exact script I had anticipated. Panic masked as concern. Messages about my mental health. Claims that he didn't know where I was and was afraid for my safety. The same story repackaged. But this time, I wasn't there to be absorbed into it. I didn't respond. I didn't correct him. I let his words exist without my participation. Without me to anchor the lie, it began to collapse under its own weight. People started asking questions. Not about me, but about him. Why he seemed to know so much about a condition I didn't have. Why his stories changed depending on who he spoke to. Why I had never mentioned any of this myself. The narrative he had so carefully constructed required my silence to survive. Once I stepped out of it, it lost its power. In the quiet of that temporary room, I started rebuilding something I hadn't realized I'd lost: trust in my own perception. I learned that paranoia isn't fear without cause. It's fear without validation. And once the validation came, the fear transformed into clarity. I stopped asking whether I had imagined the danger and started honoring the instinct that had kept me alive. I don't know what he intended in the end. I don't need to. What matters is that I recognized a situation designed to erase me and chose to step out of it before it succeeded. I chose not to become the story he told about me. I chose to live loudly enough that my absence could never be explained away. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: when someone is quietly preparing others for your disappearance, it's not love. It's not concern. It's not protection. It's a warning. And listening to that warning saved my life. I am no longer the fragile woman he described. I am no longer the unreliable narrator of my own existence. I am someone who trusted herself when it mattered most. And that choice made all the difference.